Good afternoon. National Cabinet has met again this morning. National Cabinet now is moving into a new phase, having established the many baseline supports and measures that were put in place to suppress the spread of the virus. And we're now moving into a new phase where at our regular meetings we'll be able to review the data and in particular review measures on a regular basis and make such adjustments as is necessary as we move through this next phase. But I can say this, that had the virus kept growing at the same rate it was 12 days ago, we would now have more than 10,500 cases in this country. There'd be over 5,000 more cases. And in fact, some commentators who are doing the maths were suggesting that we would have had 8,000 cases just as recently as last weekend. That is a tribute to the work that has been done by Australians in getting around and supporting the very sensible measures that are being put in place all around the country by the state and territory governments. But we must continue to do this. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. If it's a warm day, don't go en masses down to the beach. That's a simple instruction that all Australians expect other Australians to abide by. It isn't just the government asking you to do this, it's your fellow Australians asking you to do this, because by complying with those arrangements and supporting those arrangements, you're supporting your fellow Australians. We need to continue to keep the pressure on. We need to continue to suppress the virus. We are now at single-digit rates of growth, but we need to do more. The changes that you are making, Australia, are working, and we need to keep making those changes and making sure we can make those changes on a sustainable basis in our daily lives. We also must continue to get the balance right, and that's why, as I said, the National Cabinet will be regularly reviewing the data and all the baseline supports and the baseline restrictions that are in place to ensure that we're only doing what is necessary to protect the health of Australians and at the same time ensure that we continue to keep our economy running and the income that is available to people through their work will be available to them and not unreasonably taken from them. This is the road ahead. This is the road that we're making into this virus. But the National Cabinet is also very focused on the road out as well. We've talked about 6-month periods, and that is true. They're not a guarantee. It could be longer. We pray it's shorter. But a 6-month period should give people a good indication of what they have to ready themselves in terms of the changes they're making in their daily lives. So we are in what we describe today as a National Cabinet as the suppression phase. We are now in a place where we're seeking to put the pressure down on constraining this virus in Australia. We then need to look at the recovery phase, which is beyond. And I want to assure Australians that the National Cabinet is very focused on those issues as well. But in these early phases, the work has had to necessarily focus on establishing all the rules, establishing the restrictions, putting the economic supports in place, particularly through arrangements like JobKeeper and Job Seeker, to ensure we were getting the additional resources into our health system, supporting initiatives in areas of community supports, domestic violence, mental health, all of these things. Putting in place the supply lines to ensure that we can get access to the medical tests, to the PPE equipment, the personal protection equipment, and all of the upgrading of things like ICUs. And that work has been going at a great pace to ensure we have the contact tracing. And one of the most pleasing figures that the Chief Medical Officer and I have been observing each day is the great job the states and territories are doing, and they have employed an army of people to do this in their ranks, to be going out and tracing the contacts of those who have picked up the coronavirus. Those figures of untraced cases has fallen dramatically over the course of the last couple of weeks, and that is a great effort from the states, and I want to thank them for the tremendous work that each of them are doing on the end of that phone, ringing people up, tracking down where they've been. It's painstaking and frustrating work, but they're doing it, and it's saving lives and it's saving livelihoods. The National Cabinet, having putting those controls in place, will now continue to assess these measures on an ongoing basis. Today, we had a further report on modelling work that had been done. That modelling work is not yet complete. That modelling work looks at different scenarios so we can be confident to an acceptable level that the potential course of the virus in Australia will run at a pace in which our health systems will be able to support the Australian population. The early news on some of this early modelling is that at the current rate, if we keep doing what we're doing and we keep doing the work to upgrade our ICU capacity and secure the extra ventilators and all of the things we're doing right now, then right now that trajectory is promising. It's encouraging. But there are no guarantees, I want to stress. This virus writes its own rules, and we have to seek to try and understand them as best we can and respond as best we can to the pressures that we face. Now, that modelling will have further work done over the course of the next few days. It'll be reviewed again by the National Cabinet when it next meets, next Tuesday morning, and then following that, the Chief Medical Officer and I will be conducting a briefing on that information and sharing that with the nation. The good news, though, is that on the scenario planning we have at the moment, we are tracking well, but we can take none of that for granted. Also agreed today was a range of very practical issues that we believe are necessary at the margin and to address issues that have arisen in the community. From this afternoon, we'll be releasing a daily dashboard on all the key statistics with a very straightforward and simple summary by the Chief Medical Officer about the key features of that data. That will be done on a daily basis. Of course, that will be of great use to the media. Much of the data you'll already be familiar with in the media, but that information will be available on health.gov.au and people can look that up on a daily basis. It'll be published in the afternoon because that is the period of time in which all the information has come through from the states and territories. You will note many of the premiers are updating their information again the following morning, but that afternoon report is a daily baseline on where things are at on each and every day. We also agreed today that for Easter and religious services, given all of these religious services now where they are continuing are being done in a streaming or broadcaster mode, that the places where the broadcasts and the streaming is taking place from, most usually in a place of worship, they will be considered as workplaces. Now, what does that mean? It means that the same rules that apply to a workplace for those who are participating in presenting the service, conducting the service, will apply as they do in other places of work. That means, particularly for Orthodox religions, where particularly when it comes up around Easter, there are additional cantors and there are additional other religious ecclesiastical roles that are played in those services. That means there can be additional people that are taking part in the celebration of those services, not people going to church. It's the priests and the others formally involved in the conducting of the ceremonies. That way they can be faithfully relayed to the faith communities around the country. So it doesn't mean churches are not open, places of worship are not open. I want to be very clear about that. But we've had a lot of feedback from religious communities that there are ways that these services are conducted and they'll be able to do that, respecting absolutely the 4 square metres per person rule that applies in those workplaces, and that should be followed. Also, on working holiday maker visa holders, now there are many of them still in Australia, many have returned to their home countries. There are particular places that in the agricultural sector that rely on those workers each year as you go into the seasons, either for planting or for harvesting or for fruit picking and so on. And it's important that those businesses and those producers are able to continue to conduct their business. Now, of course, Australians who want to do that work, then please do. Get out there and do that work, and there'll be opportunities there for working holiday makers who are looking to engage in those occupations as they regularly do. They will be required to self-isolate and to go onto australia.gov.au and register for self-isolation and do that where they are now for a period of 14 days before they transfer to another part of the country out in a rural or regional area. At that time, their employer will be looking to see that they have conducted that self-isolation before they would be employed in that work. Now, this is important to ensure that we don't get a lift-up of the virus that might be in many metropolitan areas, and it gets transferred to more vulnerable areas in rural and regional communities, which as yet are not experiencing the same level of the virus being transmitted in those communities. So this is being done to ensure that those producers can get the work done, but also to ensure that the communities are protected. At the same time, working through the states and territories and local governments, we will be working to ensure that the workers' accommodation that would be in those places is also respecting strict health requirements. You can't have 6 backpackers in a caravan out in rural parts of the country. That's not going to happen. You need to have more strict rules around that, and local governments and shires will be observing those health rules and working with their states and territories to put those conditions in place. On the economy, we are continuing to do everything we can to limit the impacts wherever possible, and to provide all the necessary supports, and JobKeeper and JobSeeker are critical to those plans. In relation to JobKeeper, in discussion with the states and territories today, local governments and their support will be provided by the state government. So that local government employees are no different to state government employees in these arrangements. Local governments are not eligible for JobKeeper from the Commonwealth Government. Where there is support necessary, if there is support necessary for local governments, that will be provided by the state and territory governments, not the Commonwealth Government. On commercial leases, as you know, we've been working on this issue for some time, and I had hoped we'd be in a position to have finalised this today, and we are very close to doing that, and the National Cabinet considered the proposals that came forward. An industry code of practice for commercial tenancies, including retail tenancies, has been worked on by the various stakeholder groups representing tenants and landlords over the course of the next few days. That industry code, as the National Cabinet reviewed that today, has not got to the point that we believe it needs to get to ensure a sufficient security for tenants and landlords that are affected by these arrangements. What we are seeking to have happen is for the industry to complete their code, and that code would be made a mandatory code, incorporated into state and territory legislation where appropriate, where it will be mandatory for tenancies, that is the tenant and the landlord, where they have a turnover of less than 50 million and they are a participant in the JobKeeper program. As you know, the JobKeeper program has a threshold which has a 30% loss of revenue. If you're in that situation and you're a tenant, then we will be working to implement a mandatory code of practice regarding the negotiations, discussions that you will now have with your landlord to ensure that both of you, the landlord and the tenant, can get through this next period, and on the other side be able to go back to business as usual and enable those businesses to succeed and the landlords also to succeed in the future. What is important as part of this code is that both parties negotiate in good faith, that there is a proportionality principle that needs to be in this code. And that proportionality principle is simply this, that the turnover reduction of the tenant needs to be reflected in the rental waiver of the landlord. Now, how that is done inside the lease is up to the landlord and the tenant. There are many different ways you can achieve this. If, for example, there was a 3 or 6 month rental waiver because a lessee, a tenant, would have had to have closed their doors and there's just simply no money coming in, then one way to achieve that is to extend the overall lease by 6 months on the other side if they're going to give a rental waiver. Similarly, they could agree to a different level of rent over the entire term of the lease, and that was shared over a longer period of time. These are things that we do not wish to be prescriptive about. What we want to do is have landlords and tenants in the room to ensure that they can work these issues out between them so they can have an arrangement which enables them to get through this period and to get to the other side. The banks will need to come to the party as well. The banks are not parties to those arrangements, and so that makes it legally a little more difficult. But banks are already moving to providing all sorts of new facilities and arrangements to their customers, and we would expect banks to be very supportive of the agreements reached by landlords and tenants who would be working under this mandatory code. But I stress again, we would like as a national cabinet for this to be done by industry and for them to finalise a code with this proportionality principle as quickly as possible so we can move to have that adopted into state and territory regulation as a matter of a mandatory arrangement. Now, if you're in that arrangement, which you would be required to enter into if you're in the terms that I said, then you would have that protection of issues around evictions. You would have the protections around claims on penalties or acting on guarantees of interest protection on rent, or all of these matters, you would be protected. Also, the landlord would be protected in that the lease would not be able to be terminated on those grounds. So there's give and take in this. Give and take. Those tenants and landlords are being encouraged to sit around that table and get that done now. The mandatory code would require it, and if you sit outside the mandatory code, then you are leaving yourselves out in the cold. So with those measures, we are looking forward to make further progress. States would also, under those arrangements, be looking to provide various exemptions and waivers and reductions to some of their fees and rates, but we're looking to see that industry code come in place to ensure we can make progress more quickly. And that was the arrangement we came to today, and National Cabinet will consider this again at the latest on Tuesday morning, and if we're able to come to an arrangement before then we would convene to make that possible.